The neighbors used his pool without permission, ignoring all requests to leave him alone, but one day his patience broke, and he did something no one expected. Subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. Jason Hart stood at the edge of his new backyard, surveying the sparkling pool that stretched out before him. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the water, its surface reflecting the neatly trimmed hedges and the clear blue sky above. This was his sanctuary, his hard-earned retreat after years of relentless work and personal challenges. For Jason, this wasn't just a backyard. It was the embodiment of a dream he had nurtured for years, one that he had finally turned into reality after his divorce 3 years ago. Jason had thrown himself into his career as a civil engineer specializing in urban infrastructure. He worked long hours managing complex projects, and the intensity of his work left little time for personal life. But that was a sacrifice he was willing to make. When his promotion came through earlier that year, Jason decided it was time to reward himself. He sold his cramped apartment in the city and moved to the suburbs, purchasing a spacious single-story house on a quiet cul-de-sac. The house had everything he had ever wanted: a modern kitchen with stainless steel appliances, a large living room with vaulted ceilings, and most importantly, a backyard with a pristine pool. The pool had been the deciding factor. It represented an oasis of calm, where he could escape the demands of his job and the lingering loneliness that came with living alone. Here, he imagined relaxing weekends with a book in hand and the cool water inviting him for a swim whenever he needed to unwind. On his first visit, the neighborhood, too, seemed ideal. The quiet streets lined with neatly kept homes gave off a welcoming vibe, and the real estate agent had emphasized how friendly the community was by describing block parties, shared holiday celebrations, and a sense of camaraderie among the residents. While Jason wasn't particularly interested in becoming the life of the neighborhood, he appreciated the idea of living in a place where people respected each other's space. That was what he wanted most of all: space, both physical and emotional, to rebuild his life on his own terms. The day he moved in, Jason was greeted warmly by his neighbors. Across the street lived the Watsons, an elderly couple who waved from their porch as the moving truck pulled up. To his right was a young couple with a baby who offered him cookies as a welcoming gift. But the most memorable introduction came from the family next door, the Marshalls. The Marshalls were hard to miss. Charles, known as Chuck Marshall, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a booming voice and an easy smile, and his wife Melissa exuded the kind of polished friendliness that made her seem like the perfect host for any neighborhood gathering. Their 3 children, a pair of teenage twins and a younger daughter, hovered nearby as Chuck shook Jason's hand with a firm grip, saying, "Welcome to the neighborhood, man. You've got yourself a great spot here. This pool is going to be a hit. My kids are already jealous." Jason chuckled politely, unsure how to respond, not used to such forwardness, yet appreciating the gesture, replying, "Thanks, it's a nice place. Looking forward to settling in." Although the Marshall's energy was a bit overwhelming for someone who valued solitude as much as Jason did, he reminded himself that being part of a neighborhood meant some degree of interaction, and he resolved to maintain a polite but distant relationship with his new neighbors. In the first few weeks at the house, Jason experienced everything he had hoped for. He spent his evenings sitting by the pool, the soft glow of the underwater lights creating a tranquil ambience. On weekends, he swam laps in the morning and napped in the shade of the patio in the afternoon. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. He also took note of the rhythm of the neighborhood. The Watsons across the street hosted their grandchildren every Sunday, their laughter echoing through the cul-de-sac. The young couple next door often jogged together in the early mornings with their baby snug in a stroller. And as for the Marshalls, they were the most active presence on the street, with Chuck's booming laugh heard during his backyard barbecues and the sound of the twins' basketball games often carried over the fence. At first, Jason didn't mind the Marshalls' energy. It stayed confined to their own yard, and, while it was louder than he preferred, it did not infringe on his peace. But one Saturday afternoon, as Jason returned home from a run, he noticed something strange. A group of teenagers, none of whom he recognized, were splashing around in his pool. He stopped in his tracks, disbelief giving way to irritation. He had only moved in a month ago, and already someone had taken the liberty of using his property without permission. Approaching the backyard, he noticed the Marshall twins among the group, laughing and diving into the water as if they owned the place. Jason cleared his throat loudly, and the teenagers froze their laughter and turned to face him. "What's going on here?" he asked in a calm but firm tone. One of the twins, a boy with curly hair, shrugged and said, "We were just swimming. Your pool's awesome, by the way." Jason replied, "Yeah, well, it's also private property. I don't recall giving anyone permission to be here." The group mumbled apologies, quickly grabbed their towels, and scampered out of the yard through the side gate. Jason felt a mix of frustration and confusion. He hadn't expected this kind of boundary pushing in a neighborhood that had seemed so respectful. That evening, he stopped by the Marshall's house to address the issue. Chuck opened the door with a beer in hand and greeted Jason with his usual jovial demeanor. When Jason explained what had happened, Chuck nodded along with a smile that never wavered, saying, "Teenagers, they don't always think things through. I'll talk to them about it. Don't worry, it won't happen again." Jason wanted to believe him, but something about Chuck's casual attitude didn't sit right. Nevertheless, he decided to let it go for now, trusting that the conversation would be enough to set boundaries. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a larger problem. He had moved here for peace and privacy, but it seemed that maintaining those things might be more challenging than he had anticipated. In the following weeks, life in his new neighborhood continued much as it had before. The Watsons hosted their weekly family dinners, the Joggers kept their early morning routines, and Jason enjoyed peaceful evenings by the pool when he returned from work. Yet, a nagging unease settled in the back of his mind, a sense that his personal space wasn't as inviolate as he had hoped. The incident with the teenagers using his pool lingered like a stubborn stain on his thoughts. Chuck's dismissive attitude had struck Jason as a red flag. While the man's easygoing charm might have seemed harmless to others, Jason had seen enough in his lifetime to recognize the subtle signs of someone who did not take boundaries seriously. He resolved to keep an eye on the situation, hoping that his firm stance during their initial conversation would be enough to deter further incidents. But that hope proved short-lived. One Friday evening, after a particularly grueling week at work, Jason came home to find a familiar scene playing out in his backyard. The twins were back, along with a few of their friends. They were splashing and laughing, their voices carrying across the yard as if it were a public park. Jason stopped in his tracks, his pulse quickening. This time they had even brought snacks, their brightly colored bags of chips and soda cans scattered across the poolside furniture. Without bothering with pleasantries, he marched into the yard with a stern expression. The group noticed him almost immediately, their laughter faltering as they registered his presence. "What's going on here?" he asked in a calm, yet unmistakably irritated voice. The twins exchanged guilty glances before one of them, a tall, lanky boy named Ethan, spoke up, saying, "We just thought, since it's hot out, maybe you wouldn't mind." Jason said firmly, "I do mind," as he gestured toward the gate. "Get out now." The teenagers scrambled to gather their things, muttering half-hearted apologies as they left. Jason stood by the pool watching them go, his frustration mounting. This wasn't just about kids being kids. It was about respect, or the lack thereof. The pool, which had once symbolized a sanctuary, now felt like contested territory. That evening, he decided to address the issue more formally. He drafted a polite but direct note reminding the Marshalls that his property was private and that any further intrusions would not be tolerated. Early the next morning, he slipped the note into their mailbox and returned to his house, hoping that this would finally put an end to the problem. For a few days, it seemed like his message had been received. The twins stayed out of sight, and the pool remained undisturbed. Jason began to relax, allowing himself to believe that the situation had been resolved. He even considered introducing himself to a few more neighbors, hoping to establish friendly but respectful connections. But then came the Saturday afternoon barbecue. Jason had spent the morning running errands, and when he returned home around midday, he was greeted by the unmistakable sound of laughter and music emanating from his backyard. His stomach sank as he parked his car and walked to the side gate. Peering through the slats, he saw a full-fledged gathering in progress. Chuck, Melissa, their kids, and at least a dozen others were lounging by the pool, grilling burgers and sipping drinks as if they owned the place. Jason's first reaction was disbelief. How could anyone think this was acceptable? He took a deep breath to steady himself before pushing the gate open and stepping into the yard. For a moment, the scene froze as everyone turned to look at him. Chuck, standing by the grill with a pair of tongs in hand, greeted Jason with a broad, completely unbothered smile, saying, "Hey, Jason, hope you don't mind. We thought we'd make the most of this beautiful day. Your pool's too nice not to share." Jason clenched his jaw, choosing his words carefully. "Chuck, this is my property. You can't just show up here with a crowd of people and act like it's yours." Chuck laughed, the sound grating against Jason's nerves. "Oh, come on, man. We're neighbors, no harm, no foul, right? Besides, you weren't using it." Jason's patience, already wearing thin, snapped. "That's not the point. This is my home, my space. You need to leave, all of you." The guests began to murmur uncomfortably, some exchanging awkward glances. Chuck's smile faltered, but only slightly. All right," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No need to get worked up. We'll clear out." It took them another 15 minutes to actually leave, during which Jason stood silently by the gate, arms crossed, making it clear that he wasn't budging until every last guest had gone. When the yard was finally empty, he surveyed the aftermath, scattered trash, damp towels, and a half-eaten plate of food left on one of his lawn chairs. That evening, as he cleaned up the mess, a heavy sense of disillusionment settled over him. He had moved here for peace, for privacy, for a chance to build a life that was truly his own. Yet barely a month in, he was already locked in a battle to defend his boundaries against neighbors who seemed to have no concept of them. As the sun set and the yard grew quiet, Jason sat by the edge of the pool, staring into its calm, rippling surface. For the first time, it didn't feel like a haven. It felt like a battleground, and he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the worst was yet to come. The days following the barbecue were quiet, but not in a way that brought Jason any peace. The marshals seemed to take his demand to leave as a temporary setback rather than a definitive boundary. The silence felt more like a lull before the next storm, a tense waiting period during which Jason began to notice subtle shifts in their behavior. Chuck, who had once greeted him with a jovial wave whenever they crossed paths, now offered only a tight-lipped nod, while the twins avoided eye contact altogether, and even Melissa, usually bubbly and cheerful, seemed colder during chance encounters. Jason wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or concerned. On one hand, the absence of further intrusions was a welcome change. Yet on the other, the marshal's standoffishness hinted at something unspoken, as though they were silently regrouping for another push. His instincts told him to stay alert, and he was soon proven right. On a breezy Saturday morning, after spending the first half of the day mowing his lawn and pruning the hedges around his backyard with a glass of iced tea in hand, Jason sat down on his patio to enjoy the fruits of his labor. The quiet hum of the neighborhood was soothing, birds chirping, a lawn mower rumbling in the distance, and the faint chatter of children playing somewhere nearby. For a moment, Jason felt at ease. That moment was shattered by the sound of splashing. His grip on the glass tightened as he turned his head toward the commotion. Sure enough, a group of teenagers was back, and they weren't alone. The Marshall twins had brought along even more friends, and they were all having what appeared to be an impromptu pool party. Loud music blared from a portable speaker perched precariously on one of Jason's patio chairs. Jason stood, his chest tightening with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. This wasn't just a casual mistake or misunderstanding. It was blatant disregard for his property. He walked toward the pool, his shadow stretching across the water as the teenagers turned to face him. "What do you think you're doing?" Jason demanded in a voice both steady and firm. The group exchanged nervous glances before one of the twins, Ethan, spoke up in a tone half apologetic, half defensive. "We thought you were cool with it." Jason's patience had worn thin. "It's my pool," he said sharply, "and I've made it very clear that you're not allowed to use it without my permission. Get out now." The group hesitated for a moment, as though debating whether to argue, but Jason's unwavering expression left little room for negotiation. Muttering under their breath, they climbed out of the pool, grabbed their towels and belongings, and left. The speaker emitted a loud crackle as someone hastily switched it off. As they filed out through the side gate, Jason caught Ethan muttering to one of his friends, "He's such a buzzkill." Jason ignored the comment, though it stung more than he cared to admit. Once the yard was empty again, he stood by the pool, staring at the rippling water. His sanctuary, once a source of pride and solace, now tainted by repeated invasions. He had moved here to escape chaos, yet it seemed that chaos had followed him. The Marshals' persistent intrusions weren't just an annoyance. They were an attack on the life he had worked so hard to build. Jason spent the rest of the day contemplating how to address the situation. He considered calling the Marshals directly, but previous interactions with Chuck had shown that the man wasn't inclined to take his concerns seriously. The idea of involving the authorities crossed his mind. Yet as a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, he was acutely aware of how such actions could escalate. The last thing he wanted being labeled the problem neighbor, or worse, ending up in a confrontation spiraling out of control. Instead, he decided to document everything. He began keeping a log of each incident, noting the date, time, and details, and even installed a small security camera on the corner of his house aimed discreetly at the backyard, ensuring he would have evidence to back up his claims if the Marshals continued to push his boundaries. The following weekend brought yet another escalation. After returning home from the grocery store, Jason found Chuck and a group of his friends lounging by the pool, beers in hand, having brought a portable grill and flipping burgers on Jason's patio, as though it were a public park. The smell of sizzling meat mixed with the scent of chlorine, creating an almost surreal juxtaposition. Jason approached the group, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Chuck greeted him with the same disarming grin he had used during their first meeting, saying, "Hey Jason, hope you don't mind. We figured we'd keep the kids entertained while we watch the game." Jason's voice turned cold as he replied, "I do mind, Chuck. I've told you before. This is my property. You can't just come here whenever you feel like it." Chuck's grin did not falter, but there was an edge in his tone as he replied, "Relax, man. We're just neighbors hanging out. No harm, no foul." Jason took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "This isn't up for debate. You, and your friends need to leave now." The tension was palpable as the group exchanged glances, and finally, Chuck raised his hands in mock surrender, saying, All right, we'll clear out. No need to make a scene." It took them nearly half an hour to pack up their things and leave. When they were gone, Jason was left with a yard littered with empty bottles, crumpled napkins, and a lingering smell of smoke. As he cleaned up the mess that evening, a mix of anger and exhaustion settled over him. He realized he couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, waiting for the next intrusion. Something had to change. That night, Jason lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling trapped in a battle he had not asked for, yet could not ignore. The Marshals clearly didn't respect his boundaries, and polite conversations were no longer enough to fix the problem. He needed to find another way to assert his ownership of his space, something that would make it clear, once and for all, that his home was off limits. As the hours ticked by, an unconventional, maybe even risky, idea began to take shape in his mind. One with the potential to send a message that the Marshals couldn't ignore. Jason didn't want conflict, but if they forced his hand, he was prepared to fight for his peace. By the time Monday morning rolled around, he had made up his mind. If the Marshals wouldn't respect his boundaries after repeated warnings, he would have to get creative. Confrontation wasn't his style. He preferred solutions that were subtle yet effective, leaving no room for further arguments. Sitting at his desk during a rare quiet moment at work, he began researching the idea that had come to him late Saturday night as he lay in bed, replaying the scene by the pool over and over in his mind. He didn't want to involve the authorities or escalate the situation to open hostility. Instead, he needed something that would reclaim his space without direct confrontation, something to make it clear that the pool was not theirs to use. His thoughts turned to pool maintenance, a subject he had learned the basics of over the years. Yet now he dove deeper, reading article after article about water chemistry, chlorine levels, and pH balance in search of a solution that was both harmless and dramatic enough to send a message. It wasn't long before he found exactly what he was looking for: superchlorination, a common pool maintenance process that involved adding an elevated amount of chlorine to the water to kill bacteria and algae. When done properly, the water would become temporarily cloudy and uninviting, rendering the pool unusable for several days. To someone unfamiliar with pool care, it might look like a chemical disaster, harmless yet intimidating. Jason's plan was simple. He would create a spectacle that would deter the marshals from ever attempting to use his pool again. He even considered adding a harmless foaming agent to enhance the visual impact. The goal was not to scare anyone physically, but to create such a dramatic scene that no one would want to come near his property for a long time. Over the next few days, Jason gathered the necessary supplies. He visited a pool supply store on the edge of town and purchased a bulk container of chlorine granules and a foaming agent often used in themed pool parties, along with a testing kit to ensure that the pool's water would return to normal after the stunt. Every step had to be done carefully and methodically. He was not about to risk damaging the pool he had worked so hard to maintain. Each evening after work, he fine-tuned his plan, researching the exact proportions of chemicals needed to achieve the desired effect, and ran small-scale tests in a bucket to ensure that the foam wouldn't damage the pool surface. By Thursday night, he was confident that everything was ready. All that remained was to wait for the right moment. That moment came on a bright Saturday afternoon. As the sun reached its zenith, Jason returned home from the grocery store to the now familiar sounds of laughter and music coming from his backyard. He paused in his driveway, took a deep breath, and gripped the steering wheel tightly. This time, he wasn't angry or surprised. He was prepared. He parked his car, unloaded the groceries into the kitchen, and then retrieved the carefully stored supplies from the garage. With a small bucket of chlorine granules in one hand and the foaming agent in the other, he made his way toward the backyard, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and determination. When he reached the gate, he paused to take in the scene. The marshals were out in full force along with at least a dozen other people. Chuck stood by a portable grill, flipping burgers, while Melissa handed out drinks. The twins and their friends were splashing in the pool, and someone had set up a speaker that blasted pop music loud enough to rattle the windows. Without delay, Jason opened the gate and stepped inside. At first, no one noticed him. Everyone was too caught up in their revelry. He walked purposefully toward the pool, setting the bucket and foaming agent down at the water's edge. Finally, Chuck noticed him and called out, "Hey Jason, Chuck, glad you could join the party. Grab a drink and relax, man." Jason ignored the invitation without a word. He knelt by the pool and began scooping chlorine granules into the water. Almost immediately, a chemical reaction took hold. The water bubbled and churned, releasing small plumes of steam as the chlorine dissolved. A few people noticed and ceased their activities, their laughter fading into confused murmurs as Melissa asked with concern, "What's he doing?" Jason reached for the foaming agent and poured it slowly into the pool, watching deliberately as the water began to froth. Thick white bubbles rose steadily to the surface, spreading rapidly until the entire pool was covered in a layer of foam. The previously clear water turned a murky, uninviting gray. Now, everyone was staring at the pool in stunned silence. The music from the speaker seemed oddly out of place against the backdrop of confusion and growing unease. Finally, Chuck stepped forward, his expression a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. Jason turned to face him, his expression calm but resolute, and simply stated, "Pool maintenance. The water is not safe for swimming right now. You should probably leave." Chuck's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked as if he were about to argue. But the sight of the bubbling, foamy pool seemed to sap his confidence. Glancing back at his guests, many of whom were already gathering their belongings and murmuring about heading home, Melissa placed a hand on Chuck's arm and said quietly, "Let's go. We'll talk about this later." One by one, the guests trickled out of the yard, leaving behind only Chuck, Melissa, and their kids. Chuck lingered for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Jason. But in the end, with a final frustrated shake of his head, he turned and walked away, his family following close behind. When the yard was finally empty, Jason let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing for the first time that day. He looked down at the foamy, clouded pool and smiled faintly. It wasn't the peaceful oasis he had envisioned when he bought the house, but for now it would do. More importantly, it was his oasis, and he intended to keep it that way. As he began cleaning up the leftover supplies, he couldn't help but wonder how the marshals would respond. He knew this wasn't the end of the conflict. It was only the beginning, but for the first time, he felt that he had the upper hand, and that was a good start. The aftermath of Jason's bold move played out much as he had anticipated. Though the tension in the neighborhood was palpable, the day after the incident, the marshal's backyard was unusually quiet. No loud laughter, no clinking of glasses, no teenagers bouncing basketballs on the driveway. It was as if the entire family had retreated into their house to regroup and process what had happened. Meanwhile, Jason spent the day meticulously cleaning the pool, the foamy water and chemical imbalance having served their purpose, and then restored his oasis to its pristine condition by testing the pH levels, adjusting the chlorine, and running the filtration system until the water sparkled once more. The process was laborious, but to Jason it was worth it. Every bucket of clean water he added to the pool felt like reclaiming a piece of his space. By mid-afternoon, his yard had returned to the serene refuge it had been when he first moved in. Jason sat on a lounge chair with a glass of iced tea, enjoying the sound of birds chirping in the trees overhead. For the first time in weeks, his backyard felt like his own again. That peace, however, lasted only until Monday morning. As Jason was sipping his coffee and reading emails, he heard the doorbell ring. Setting his mug down, he walked to the door and opened it to find Chuck standing on the porch. The man's posture was tense, his arms crossed over his chest, and his jaw clenched. His usual jovial demeanor was gone, replaced by something colder and more calculating. "Morning, Chuck," Jason said evenly, keeping his expression neutral. "We need to talk," Chuck said curtly, about what Jason had done to the pool. Jason raised an eyebrow and leaned casually against the doorframe. "Why did to my pool?" Chuck's nostrils flared as he replied. "Don't play games with me, Jason. That stunt you pulled ruined my weekend. Everyone who came over left thinking your pool was some kind of toxic hazard." Jason fought the urge to smirk and responded, "Well, Chuck, if your weekend was ruined, maybe it's because you were trespassing on my property. I've told you before that the pool is off limits, but you didn't listen." Chuck stepped closer, his voice lowering to a growl. "We didn't have to go that far. We're neighbors, for God's sake. This is supposed to be a community." Jason's patience was wearing thin. "Chuck, I've tried talking to you. I've asked politely, but you ignored every word I said. If you don't like the consequences, maybe you should think twice before walking into someone else's yard uninvited." Chuck opened his mouth to respond, but stopped, as if realizing he wasn't going to win this argument. He took a step back, shaking his head. "Fine, you've made your point, but don't expect anyone around here to take your side if you keep pulling stunts like that." Jason gave a small, non-committal shrug. "I'm not looking for sides, Chuck. I'm looking for peace, and that's all I've ever wanted." With that, Chuck turned and walked back toward his house, and Jason watched him go, a mix of relief and weariness settling in his chest. The conversation had gone about as well as he had expected. Chuck was angry, but not outright confrontational. Still, Jason knew better than to assume the matter was resolved, as Chuck didn't strike him as someone who would back down easily. In the next few weeks, the marshals kept their distance. The twins no longer sneaked into the yard, and Chuck's booming voice was noticeably absent from the neighborhood. It was almost as if they had finally taken Jason's warnings to heart. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a temporary reprieve, a pause rather than a resolution. The rest of the neighborhood, however, seemed to notice the tension. During his evening walks, he received a few curious glances from other neighbors, and even the Watsons who lived across the street stopped him one afternoon to ask how things were going. "You've been awfully quiet over there," Mrs. Watson said in a friendly yet probing tone. Jason smiled politely and replied, "Just been busy with work. Things are fine." She gave him a knowing look, as though suspecting there was more to the story, but decided not to press the issue. "Well, if you ever need anything, You know where to find us." Jason thanked her and continued his walk, feeling both grateful for the support and wary of the neighborhood gossip that might be brewing. He had no intention of dragging anyone else in the mess with the Marshalls. This was his problem to handle, and he would see it through alone. 2 weeks later, while Jason was relaxing in his living room one evening, he heard a loud knock at the door. Opening it, he found Melissa Marshall standing on his porch, her expression a mixture of frustration and apology. "Jason, can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice carrying both urgency and gentleness. Jason stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in, and they sat at the dining table. For a long moment, neither spoke. Melissa fidgeted with her hands, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for the right words. Finally, she said, "Look, I know things have gotten tense between us, and I know Chuck can be a bit much sometimes, but this whole situation is getting out of hand. The kids don't understand why they can't go swimming anymore, and Chuck feels like you're singling us out." Jason took a deep breath, keeping his tone measured as he replied, "Melissa, I'm not singling anyone out. I'm protecting my property. I've tried talking to Chuck, but he doesn't listen. I've been more than patient, but enough is enough." Melissa nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I get it, really I do, and I'll talk to Chuck again. I just hope we can move past this. We're neighbors, after all." Jason hesitated before replying, "I want that too, Melissa, but it has to start with boundaries. If Chuck and the kids respect my space, there won't be any more problems." Melissa smiled faintly. "Fair enough, I'll do my best." After she left, Jason sat alone at the table, his thoughts churning. He wanted to believe that things could improve, that the Marshalls would finally learn to respect his boundaries. But a small voice in the back of his mind warned him not to let his guard down. The conflict might be subsiding, but it wasn't over. Not yet. In the days following Melissa's visit, an oddly peaceful calm returned to Jason's home. The Marshalls seemed to be making an effort to respect his boundaries. The twins no longer loitered near the property line, and even Chuck's boisterous voice no longer echoed through the cul-de-sac. It was as if the family had taken Jason's warnings and actions to heart, or at least decided it wasn't worth the trouble to continue pushing. Seizing the opportunity, Jason took the chance to fully reclaim his space. He spent an entire weekend tending to his backyard, restoring it to the haven he had envisioned when he first bought the house. The patio furniture was cleaned and rearranged, the lawn meticulously trimmed, and the pool returned to its crystal-clear perfection. Sitting by the water with a cold drink in hand, Jason finally felt a sense of accomplishment. His backyard was his again. Yet, despite the outward peace, a lingering unease remained. The Marshalls were quiet, but the abrupt shift felt almost too good to be true. Chuck didn't strike him as the type to back down easily, and Jason couldn't help but wonder if this calm was merely the prelude to another storm. The neighborhood itself seemed to take notice of the change. During his evening walks, Jason often caught his neighbors casting curious glances his way, and on a trip to the local grocery store, Mr. Watson greeted him with a warm smile before quickly shifting the conversation toward recent events. "Been pretty quiet on your end lately," Mr. Watson remarked in a light yet probing tone. "Everything all right with the Marshalls?" Jason hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, and replied carefully, "Things are fine. I think we've come to an understanding." Mr. Watson nodded, though his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Chuck can be a bit stubborn, but he's not a bad guy. Just take some time to figure out how to deal with him." Jason forced a polite smile and nodded before changing the subject, not wanting to fuel neighborhood gossip. Yet the conversation left him with a nagging sense that his feud with the Marshalls had become a topic of discussion among the residents. That evening, Jason sat on his patio, staring at the pool as the sun dipped below the horizon. He reflected on everything that had transpired over the past weeks, from the initial excitement of moving into the neighborhood to the mounting frustration with the Marshalls and the drastic measures he had taken to protect his space. While he didn't regret his actions, he could not ignore the toll the conflict had taken on him. What should have been a peaceful new chapter in his life had turned into a battle for boundaries, leaving him drained and wary. As the weeks passed, the tension in the neighborhood began to ease. The Marshalls remained distant but cordial, offering only a nod or a polite wave when their paths crossed. Jason continued his routine, enjoying the quiet and rebuilding his sense of normalcy. But the experience had changed him. He found himself more guarded, more cautious about interactions with his neighbors. The dream of a tranquil suburban life felt slightly tarnished, its edges dulled by the reality of navigating complex social dynamics. One Saturday morning, as Jason sipped his coffee on the patio, he noticed something unusual. Chuck was standing in his own backyard alone, his gaze fixed on the fence that separated their properties. After a moment, Chuck approached the fence and cleared his throat, catching Jason's attention. "Hey, Chuck, got a minute?" he called, his voice lacking its usual bravado. Jason hesitated before setting his coffee down and walking over to the fence. "What's up?" he asked. Chuck rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncharacteristically sheepish, and said, "I just wanted to say maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I know we've been a pain, and I get why you were upset. I guess I didn't realize how much the pool meant to you." Jason studied Chuck's face, searching for any hint of insincerity, and to his surprise, saw a genuine expression replacing his usual cocky grin. "I appreciate you saying that," Jason replied carefully. "I've worked hard for this place, and I needed you to understand that." Chuck nodded and added, "I get it, I do, and I'll make sure the kids know to stay out of your yard from now on. No more uninvited pool parties, I promise." The two men stood in silence for a moment as the tension between them began to dissolve. Although Jason wasn't ready to fully trust Chuck, he sensed that this was a step in the right direction and said, "Thanks, that means a lot." Chuck offered a small smile before turning and heading back to his house. Over the next few days, subtle changes in the Marshalls' behavior became apparent. The twins greeted Jason with polite nods when they saw him. Melissa waved from her car as she pulled out of the driveway, and even Chuck once stopped by with a six-pack of beer as a peace offering. While they weren't exactly friends, the animosity that had once defined their relationship was slowly being replaced by mutual respect. A month had passed since Jason and Chuck's tentative truce, and the neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm, with families chatting over fences, children riding bikes on quiet streets, and weekend barbecues filling the air with the scent of grilled food. Jason found himself relaxing into the life he had envisioned when he first moved in. The Marshalls had kept their word. No more uninvited guests in his yard. No more late-night parties echoing through the cul-de-sac. The peace felt hard-earned, and Jason cherished it. Yet, there was a lingering thought he couldn't quite shake. While the conflict with the Marshalls had subsided, the distance between him and his neighbors still lingered. He did not want to be seen as a recluse or, worse, the troublemaker. After much thought, he decided on a solution: a neighborhood barbecue that would allow him to set clear boundaries on his own terms while showing his neighbors that he was open to community and connection. It was a way to mend fences, figuratively speaking, and perhaps even build some goodwill in the process. The Saturday before the event, Jason spent the day preparing. He scrubbed the patio, cleaned the grill, and carefully planned a menu that balanced simplicity with flavor: burgers, hot dogs, grilled vegetables, and a few side dishes, including a batch of his mother's famous potato salad, a family recipe that had always been a hit at gatherings. He personally delivered invitations to his neighbors on the street, keeping the tone light and welcoming. When he reached the Marshall's house, he hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. Melissa answered with a wary yet polite expression. "Hey, Melissa, I'm hosting a barbecue tomorrow afternoon, and I'd like you and your family to come. It's a chance to reset, you know." Melissa blinked in surprise before returning a smile and saying, "That sounds nice, thanks. I'll let Chuck know." The next day, the weather was perfect, sunny with a gentle breeze. Jason had set up tables with plenty of seating, laid out a spread of food, and filled a cooler with ice-cold drinks. As the guests arrived, he greeted each of them warmly, engaging in small talk and introducing himself to those he hadn't met before. The Watsons were the first to arrive, followed by the young couple with their baby, and to Jason's pleasant surprise, the Marshalls arrived as well. Chuck looked hesitant as he approached Jason with a bottle of wine in one hand, saying in an unusually subdued tone, "Thanks for the invite. I didn't think you'd want us here after everything." Jason waved off the comment, replying, "It's water under the bridge. Today's about starting fresh." Chuck nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly, while Melissa and the kids followed, each offering polite greetings. Jason noticed the twins looking around the backyard with expressions that mixed nostalgia and restraint, as though unsure how to behave now that the pool was off limits. Inwardly, Jason appreciated their newfound respect for his space. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere grew increasingly lively. The smell of grilled food wafted through the air as neighbors chatted and laughed, their voices mingling with the soft tunes from Jason's portable speaker. To his surprise, the Marshalls blended seamlessly into the group. Chuck shared stories about his days as a college athlete. Melissa chatted with the Watsons about gardening, and the twins helped a group of kids set up a game of cornhole. Jason kept a watchful eye on the proceedings, ensuring that everyone was comfortable and that the boundaries he had worked so hard to establish remained intact. To his relief, the guests respected his unspoken rules. No one wandered too close to the pool, and everyone cleaned up after themselves, leaving the yard as pristine as it had been at the start of the day. Later, as the sun dipped low on the horizon and the party began to wind down, Jason found himself standing by the grill with Chuck. The two men had hardly spoken all afternoon, each seeming content to let the event serve as a quiet olive branch. But as the last of the food was cleared away, Chuck broke the silence, his voice low as he said, "Jason, I know I've said it before, but I want to say it again. I'm sorry for the way we acted. We didn't respect your space, and that was wrong." Jason turned to face him, surprised by the sincerity in Chuck's tone, and replied, "I appreciate that, and I'm glad we've moved past it. I just hope we can keep things respectful from here on out." Chuck nodded earnestly. "We will, I promise." For the first time since the conflict began, Jason felt a genuine sense of understanding between them. It wasn't friendship, not yet, anyway, but it was a start. As the last of the guests left and the yard fell quiet, Jason stood by the pool watching the moonlight dance on its surface, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction not only from the success of the barbecue, but also from the realization that he had taken control of his life and his space. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught him the value of standing up for himself and the importance of setting boundaries, a lesson he had long forgotten in the rush of everyday life. In the weeks that followed, Jason's home was no longer just a place to live. It had become his sanctuary, his retreat, and a space he could finally call his own. Neighbors began to notice the change. During his evening walks, he was met with warm smiles and friendly greetings from people who had previously avoided eye contact. The Watsons occasionally waved him over for a chat on their porch, and the young couple next door even invited him to join them for a game night. Although Jason didn't mind being included, he was careful to balance his interactions with his need for solitude. After everything he had been through, he wasn't eager to sacrifice the hard-earned peace he had achieved. One Saturday morning, as Jason sipped his coffee by the pool, he noticed the Marshall twins playing basketball in their driveway. Their laughter, now no longer grating on him as it once had, blended into the background, a subtle part of the suburban harmony he had long sought. The twins glanced his way and, to Jason's surprise, waved. He returned the gesture with a small smile, a simple interaction that felt like progress. As weeks turned into months, Jason found himself settling into a rhythm. His workdays were long but fulfilling, and his evenings were spent enjoying the tranquility of his home. The pool became his haven once more, a place where he could swim laps under the stars or simply sit and reflect on how far he had come. The change in his relationship with the Marshalls was subtle but significant. Melissa occasionally stopped by with a plate of cookies or a new recipe she thought he might like, and even Chuck, though still not a close friend, exchanged a few friendly words with Jason over the fence in light, easy conversations. One afternoon, Jason came home to find a handwritten note on his doorstep. It was from Chuck, inviting him to a small barbecue that the Marshalls were hosting that weekend. Jason hesitated, memories of their earlier conflicts flashing through his mind. But as he looked at the note, he realized that this was a chance to close the chapter on their rocky start and truly move forward. On the day of the barbecue, Jason arrived with a bottle of wine in hand. Chuck greeted him at the door, his usual bravado tempered by a genuine warmth that Jason hadn't seen before. The gathering was smaller and quieter than the chaotic pool parties of the past, and Jason found himself enjoying the easy camaraderie that had taken root as the sun set and the guests began to leave. He lingered for a moment, chatting with Melissa and Chuck by the grill, discussing everything from gardening tips to local news, conversations free of the tension that had once defined their interactions. For the first time, Jason felt like he was part of the community and not just an outsider looking in. That night, as he walked back to his house, Jason paused by the pool with the moonlight reflecting off its surface. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the challenges, the conflicts, and the lessons learned along the way. His home was more than just a place to live. It was a testament to his resilience, his ability to adapt, and his unwavering determination to create a life that was truly his own. Standing there, amidst the quiet hum of the neighborhood, Jason smiled as he realized that the peace he had fought for was no longer elusive. It was present in the stillness of the night, in the calm waters of the pool, in the laughter of children playing down the street, and in the friendly waves of neighbors who now saw him as part of their world. He took a deep breath, savoring the moment, knowing that the battles of the past were behind him and that the future stretched out before him like the calm, undulating waters of his cherished pool. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt truly at home. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more great stories like this one. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for our next video and check out others you might have missed. See you next time.